Hey there, you are on the Fall Asleep with Margot channel. Get comfortable and please write the name of your city or country in the comments. This will really help the channel grow. Thank you. And we go on. Tonight, we aren't journeying to ancient Rome or medieval castles. No, our destination is closer in time, but shrouded in a different kind of haze, the haze of recent memory and political intrigue. We are traveling to the not-so-distant past, the tail end of the 80s, an era you can almost feel through the cultural artifacts it left behind. The bright ghetto blaster boomboxes pumping out synth pop, hairstyles that defied both gravity and logic, fashion that was confidently loud, and beneath that vibrant, sometimes garish surface, a world locked in the final tense stages of the Cold War. It was an era of very specific, very messy relationships between the powerful and the less powerful. A time of proxies, puppets, and strong men who sometimes forgot which hands held their strings. You know that feeling, don't you, when you watch the news today and see a familiar script playing out? A global superpower levels accusations, corruption, tyranny, threats to stability against the leader of a smaller but strategically vital nation. The rhetoric heats up, sanctions loom like storm clouds, and the world holds its breath, wondering if this is just diplomatic theater or the prelude to something more concrete. It feels like a recurring dream or perhaps a recurring nightmare. The costumes change, the accents are different, but the core dynamics, they have a hauntingly familiar rhythm. Tonight, we are pulling back the curtain on one of the classic, almost textbook examples of that very drama. Our stage is a slender, S-shaped isthmus clinging to the underbelly of Central America. Panama, a country whose entire modern identity, wealth, and misfortune are inextricably tied to a single monumental feat of engineering. And our central character is a man with a pockmarked face and a notoriously volatile temper, General Manuel Antonio Noriega Moreno, a man who for decades was cultivated, funded and protected by Washington as a trusted asset, a bulwark against communism, our man in Panama, and who, almost overnight it seemed, was transformed into an international pariah, a narco-dictator, and ultimately target number one of the world's most powerful military. How does such a dramatic reversal happen? How does a valued friend become an existential enemy? It's a story that begins not with a bang, but with a whisper of intelligence shared in a Panama City safe house in the 60s. And it ends, quite literally, with the earth-shaking bang of American ordnance exploding over that same city on a December night in 1989, an invasion bizarrely launched in the sentimental glow of the Christmas season. But to understand the why, the sheer, uncompromising fury of the American response, we must first understand the what that they were so desperate to protect. We have to talk about the prize, the jewel, the raison d'être for a century of American interest in this narrow strip of land. We have to understand the Panama Canal not just as a map feature, but as a living, pulsing entity. So close your eyes for a moment and let's build a picture. Not from a history book, but from the ground, or rather from the water. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a massive container ship, the Ever Given's bigger, less clumsy cousin. You are floating in the warm, turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea, of Panama's northern coast, of Panama's northern coast. Ahead of you lies not an open ocean, but the mouth of a man-made river leading into the continent. This is the Atlantic entrance to the canal. Now, let's pull our perspective higher, into a satellite's view. See the shape of the Americas. To sail from New York to San Francisco or from Liverpool to Yokohama, the natural route is a nightmarish 8,000-mile odyssey south. You must brave the treacherous icy waters around Cape Horn, the southernmost tip of South America, a place sailors called the sailors' graveyard for centuries. It added weeks, sometimes months, to a journey. It was costly, dangerous, and utterly inefficient for a world stepping into the age of steam and steel. Now, look at Panama, that slim serpentine bridge between continents. For centuries, it was a malaria-infested jungle, a geographic obstacle. But to engineers and empire builders, it presented a tantalizing possibility, a shortcut, a cosmic-scale ditch, the ultimate time saver. Then came the Americans. With newfound imperial confidence after the Spanish-American War and with the president, Theodore Roosevelt, who famously preferred to speak softly and carry a backstick. They saw an opportunity not just to build a canal, but to control it. In 1903, they deftly engineered Panama's separation from Colombia, a story for another sleepy night, and secured, in perpetuity, a swath of land 5 miles wide on either side of the proposed canal route, the Canal Zone. And here is where our modern story truly finds its roots. The Canal Zone wasn't just a construction site or a military base. It was a fully fledged American colony implanted in the heart of a sovereign nation. It had its own government, its own police, the Canal Zone police with their distinctive uniforms, its own post office issuing U.S. stamps, its own courts, and its own schools where the children of American Zonians studied a stateside curriculum. They celebrated the 4th of July. They lived in tidy, air-conditioned houses with manicured lawns. It was a physical manifestation of power, a constant, daily reminder to Panama that the most valuable piece of their territory wasn't truly theirs. The canal itself, when it opened in 1914, was a marvel. It's not a simple trench of ocean water. That would be impossible due to the rugged continental divide. Instead, it's a water bridge. Think of it as the world's most sophisticated elevator system for ships. A vessel entering from the Atlantic is raised 85 feet, about 26 meters, through a series of 3 consecutive locks, the Gatun locks, like a giant bathtub being filled. It then sails across the vast, artificial Gatun Lake, created by damming a river, before traversing the Gaillard Gut, a mountain gorge sliced in two by dynamite and dredges. Finally, it is lowered back down to Pacific sea level via the Pedro Miguel and Miraflores locks. The entire transit takes about 8-10 hours, a serene, slow-motion ballet of engineering that replaces a weeks-long storm-tossed odyssey. The numbers are staggering. A single transit of the canal saves a ship traveling from the US East Coast to Asia approximately 8,000 nautical miles and 3 weeks of travel time. Today, over 14,000 vessels pass through annually, carrying about 6% of all global maritime trade. That's everything from your Korean electronics and Chinese textiles to Midwest grain and Peruvian copper. It's a circulatory system of globalization, a pitch point upon which the smooth flow of the modern world depends. Who controls that pinch point holds immense, almost unthinkable power. For most of the 20th century, that controller was the United States. The canal was legally American property, administered by the Panama Canal Company, a U.S. government agency. It was the crown jewel of American hemispheric dominance, a strategic choke point, vital for moving the U.S. Navy between oceans. During the Second World War, its security was paramount. During the Cold War, its neutrality was non-negotiable. Letting it fall under the influence of a hostile, or perhaps worse, an unstable and unreliable power was simply an unthinkable scenario for any American strategist in Washington. So, for the United States, Panama was never, ever just another country. It was the guardian of a vital organ. The Panamanian government was less a sovereign partner and more a landlord who lived in the guest house, expected to keep the grounds tidy, while the tenant in the main mansion called all the shots. This created a deep, festering resentment in the Panamanian national psyche, a burning desire for true sovereignty over their most famous geographic feature. This simmering tension would boil over in dramatic fashion in 1964 during the so-called flag riots. Students of Panama, demanding the right to fly their national flag next to the stars and stripes in the canal zone, clashed with American students and zone police. The confrontation escalated into full-scale riots that left over 20 Panamanians and 4 Americans dead. The images of violence on the front pages of American newspapers were a shock. They forced Washington to the negotiation table, beginning the long, complex process that would eventually lead to the 1977 Torrijos Carta Treaties, which set a timeline for the handover of the canal to Panama by the end of 1999. But here is the critical link to our story. The man who negotiated those treaties for Panama wasn't a suit from the foreign ministry. He was a charismatic, populist, nationalist military officer who had seized power in a coup years earlier. General Omar Torrijos, and Torrijos' right-hand man, his chief of military intelligence, was a shrewd, ambitious, and notoriously ruthless colonel named Manuel Noriega. Torrijos was the father of modern Panamanian nationalism. Noriega was his dark apprentice, the man who knew all the secrets, who controlled the shadows. And it was in these shadows that the foundations of our bedtime story were laid. For a while, Noriega was helping Torrijos stand up to the Yankee colossus in public. He was also quietly, diligently building a different kind of relationship with them in private. And so, with the stage set, the glittering price of the canal, the bitter history of the zone, the rising tide of nationalism, and the looming American giant, we can finally turn our attention to the man at the center of the storm. The boy from the poor neighborhood of La Cresta who dreamed of power. The medical student who found his calling in the military. The intelligence officer who learned that information was the ultimate currency. The ally who became a monster, and the monster who was, in the end, devoured by his creator. So who was this man really? before the general's uniform, before the CIA pay stubs, before the nickname Pineapple Face for his pockmarked skin. To understand the tool, you have to see the raw material. Manuel Antonio Noriega Moreno was born in 1934 in a poor barrio of Panama City. His childhood was a story of modest means and quiet humiliation. He was given up by his biological mother and raised by a school teacher, a fact that biographers say planted a deep seed of insecurity and a craving for belonging, for a structure to latch onto. As a young man, he harbored a very conventional dream. He wanted to be a psychiatrist. There is an irony there, isn't there? The future torturer and manipulator, initially drawn to the art of healing minds. He even won a scholarship to study medicine in Peru. But destiny, or perhaps his own temperament, steered him toward a different kind of anatomy, the anatomy of power. In Peru, he attended a military academy, and here, in the rigid hierarchy, the clear chains of command, the promise of respect through rank and fear, young Noriega found his true calling. He returned to Panama not as a doctor, but as a sub-lieutenant in the National Guard. Now picture the Panama of the late 50s and early 60s. It's a geopolitical petri dish. The Canal Zone is the gleaming American fortress. The Cuban Revolution just next door has Washington in a state of near panic. The number one all-consuming goal of US policy in Latin America is simple: prevent another Cuba. And how do you do that? You need eyes and ears everywhere. You need local assets. Enter a young, ambitious, shrewd military officer with a head for intelligence work. Noriega stood out. He was smart, organized, and crucially, he was ambitious. He wanted to rise, and he understood that in his world, having a powerful patron was the fastest elevator. His first major patron within Panama was General Omar Torrijos, who recognized his cunning and made him a key part of his intelligence apparatus. But his most powerful patron was waiting in the wings with a different kind of currency. The exact moment of the handshake is lost to classified files, but by the early 60s, Manuel Noriega was on the CIA's payroll. The recruitment pitch wouldn't have been subtle. It was a transaction, wrapped in the language of mutual interest. The Americans needed reliable information on everything, on Torrijos' true intentions, on communist sympathizers in Panama, on the mood in the streets. They needed a man inside the Panamanian military who could be their compass. And what did Noriega get? Oh, he got the good stuff. Cash. Certainly a steady, generous income that far exceeded his army salary. Training, perhaps in the dark arts of interrogation and surveillance. But most importantly, he got protection and promotion. With a quiet nod from Washington, his path within the Panamanian power structure was greased. When Torrijos needed a ruthless and effective head of military intelligence, the G2, who better than the man who already had the backing of the most powerful player in the region? It was a perfect, cynical symbiosis. Think of it like this: the CIA was building a fence. They needed a certain kind of post strong, planted deep in the local soil, able to withstand pressure. They found Noriega, nurtured him, and helped him grow into that post. They watered him with money and shielded him from the weeds of political opposition. For years, he was a stellar asset. He provided valuable intelligence. He helped ensure Panama, despite Torrijos' nationalist bluster, remained firmly in the anti-communist camp. He even, in a deliciously dark twist, became a valued point of contact for the US Drug Enforcement Administration in the 70s, offering tips on drug shipments, often, it's believed, from rival cartels, thus cleverly consolidating his own power. This is the foundational truth of the entire saga. Manuel Noriega, the future demonized dictator, was for decades a creature of American design. He wasn't a rogue element who burst onto the scene. He was a carefully tended asset who, one day, decided the ledger of power had changed. He stopped seeing himself as a post in their offense and started believing he was the landowner. And that, as we'll see, is when the quiet transactional relationship began to curdle into something toxic and ultimately explosive. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, just imagine the young officer receiving his envelopes, filing his reports, learning that loyalty is a fluid concept and that the strongest allegiance is to one's own assent. It's a quiet beginning to a very loud end. So Noriega had his patrons, Torrijos inside Panama and the shadowy handlers from Langley outside. When Amar Torrijos died in a mysterious plane crash in 1981, the stage was set for the apprentice to become the master. Noriega didn't seize the presidency directly. That was too crude. Instead, he became the power behind a series of puppet presidents, while he solidified his control as the true commander of the Panama Defense Forces. This was the birth of the Noriega regime, a strange, gothic, and deeply toxic political creature. To understand its nature, imagine a three-legged stool, each leg as essential for its wobbly, unsettling balance. The first leg was blunt political repression. Noriega's intelligence apparatus, the G2, was his iron first. Opposition figures, student activists, and even critical journalists would disappear. A notorious case was the brutal 1985 beheading and torture of Hugo Spadafora, a popular doctor and former vice minister who had publicly accused Noriega of drug trafficking. Spadafora's mutilated body, found in a mail sack near the Costa Rican border, sent a chill through the nation. It was a message written in blood. Dissent could be fatal. The military courts held absolute power. Elections, when they were held, were blatantly fraudulent. In 1984, international observers watched in disbelief as, after an opposition candidate seemed poised to win, the vote counting suddenly stopped overnight. When it resumed, Noriega's candidate had won. It was repression with a thin, cynical veneer of legality. The second leg was systematic brazen corruption. But this wasn't just petty bribery. This was grand, institutionalized larceny. Noriega turned the state into a personal racketeering enterprise. He took cuts from every major business deal. But his most lucrative venture was turning Panama into the ultimate safe haven for the dirty money of the world, particularly the Colombian cocaine cartels. Under his protection, Panama's banking system became a labyrinthine car wash for billions in narco dollars. He provided safe transit for drug shipments, offered clean passports, and ensured that the Medellin cartel's operations faced no interference from Panamanian authorities, for a hefty fee, of course. It's said that he even acted as a middleman, brokering deals between warring cartels. The man who once gave tips to the DIA was now the cartel's most valuable client. His personal fortune ballooned into the hundreds of millions. And then the third leg, the one that adds the surreal, almost cinematic layer, occultism and superstition. Noriega was a deeply superstitious man, a devotee of brujeria, witchcraft, and santeria. His personal spiritual advisor was a shadowy Jamaican figure known as Professor Frederick Donner. Noriega was said to wear red underwear for protection, to sprinkle ritual powders in his offices and on his uniforms to ward off enemies and confound his rivals. He would reportedly consult physics and spiritists before major decisions. This wasn't a quirky side note. It was integral to his psychology and his rule. It fostered an aura of unpredictable, irrational power. How do you negotiate with a man who might base his foreign policy on a chicken bone reading? How do you plot against a general who believes he's shielded by magical amulets? It created a court of fear where logic was subordinate to ritual. The regime's propaganda even mixed nationalist symbols with mystical ones, creating a cult of personality that was as bizarre as it was intimidating. So picture this regime. By day, a quasi-military government issuing decrees. By night, a partnership with the world's most violent drug lords. And in the shadows, ceremonies to summon protection from the spirits. It was a toxic cocktail of fear, greed, and madness. And here lies the central contradiction for Washington. For years, they could justify the first leg, repression, as stability against communism. They could ignore the third leg, the occultism, as local color. But the second leg, the drug trafficking, became an intolerable public relations and political nightmare. The war on drugs was a flagship policy of the Reagan era. How could the US wage a global war on narcotics while its own longtime asset was one of the war's chief financiers and facilitators? The hypocrisy was too glaring, too damning. Noriega was no longer just a difficult ally. He was a living, breathing testament to the moral bankruptcy of Washington's ends justify the means Cold War policy. This was the man, then, who sat atop the Panama Canal, not a sober, calculating ideologue, but a superstitious, corrupt, and ruthless militarist, whose actions were increasingly dictated by paranoia, greed, and a belief in his own magical invincibility. He was no longer just a post in the fence. He had become a wild, poisonous vine, threatening to strangle the very structure he was meant to support. The relationship between Noriega and Washington then entered a phase of slow, agonizing divorce. It wasn't a single argument, but a death by 1,000 cuts, each incident a snip of the thread that had bound them for decades. The first major public snip came in June 1987. A former senior officer in Noriega's own defense forces, Colonel Roberto Diaz Herrera, made an astonishing public confession. He accused Noriega of rigging elections, orchestrating the murder of Hugo Spadafora, and even of being involved in the plane crash that killed Omar Torrijos. More damagingly for the Americans, he flatly stated that Noriega had funneled money from drug trafficking to the US. Backed Contra rebels in Nicaragua, a scandal that was already erupting in Washington as the Iran-Contra affair. This wasn't an enemy talking. This was an insider laying bare the corruption Washington had long chosen to ignore. Panamanians, emboldened, took to the streets in the first massive protests against Noriega. He responded by sending his Doberman shock troops to brutally crush the dissent. This put the Reagan administration in a terrible bind. The secret cabals and quiet payments could no longer hide the reality. The US Senate, smelling blood, passed a resolution calling for Noriega to step down, and so began the formal policy of pressure. Think of it as a toolbox of coercion, opened one tool at a time. First, the diplomatic range. The US recalled its ambassador and dramatically downsized its embassy staff. Then, the economic vice. In March 1988, the Treasury Department froze all Panamanian government assets in the US and prohibited all payments from American entities, including companies and individuals, to the Noriega regime. This was a body blow. Panama's dollar-based economy seized up. Salaries for government workers, including the military, went unpaid. Businesses tied to the state collapsed. The goal was to turn the elite and ultimately the army against their leader. Finally, the legal hammer. In February 1988, just before the sanctions hit, federal grand juries in Miami and Tampa indicted Noriega on multiple counts of drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. The indictments were spectacular, detailing how he took millions in bribes to provide safe passage for cocaine and launder money. The message was seismic. The United States of America was now formally seeking the extradition of a sitting head of state it had once bankrolled. Noriega didn't buckle. He dug in. He understood the power of the pawn. He declared a state of war with the United States, a largely symbolic but inflammatory move. He cultivated his image as a nationalist David standing up to the Goliath, a narrative that still found some purchase among those who remembered the humiliations of the Canal Zone. He tightened his grip on the PDF, purging officers suspected of disloyalty. The situation on the ground became a tense daily standoff. The U.S. Southern Command, based in the Canal Zone, began a constant series of military exercises, Operation Purple Storm, Operation Sand Flea, right on the doorstep of Noriega's forces. The drills were provocations, a show of raw power meant to intimidate and test responses. Panamanian troops would often gather to watch, shout insults, and play loud music to drown out the maneuvers. It was a psychological war, a bizarre and dangerous game of chicken played in the tropical heat. The breaking point needed a spark, something that would translate economic pain and legal indictments into a casus belli, a justification for war. It came in the chaotic days leading up to the invasion. First, in May 1989, Noriega nullified presidential elections after early results showed his opponent, Guillermo Endara, winning in a landslide. Thugs from Noriega's Dignity battalions stormed the election counting center and savagely beat Endara and his running mate on the street, an act captured on film and broadcast worldwide. The image of the bloodied, suit-clad opposition candidate was a public relations disaster for Noriega and made a mockery of Washington's calls for democratic transition. Then, in December, the incidents escalated. After a series of harassments of U.S. military personnel and their families, a group of PDF officers shot and killed a U.S. Marine lieutenant, Robert Paz, at a roadblock. A U.S. Navy officer and his wife who witnessed the shooting were detained and assaulted. For the newly inaugurated President George Bush, a former CIA director who knew the Noriega file intimately, this was the final, unforgivable transgression. At Fort Amador, a sprawling compound at the Pacific entrance to the canal, where U.S. and Panamanian forces lived in tense proximity, U.S. Army Rangers fast-roped from hovering helicopters directly onto the parade ground. And where was Noriega? He was the grand prize and he was nowhere to be found. He had been at the commandancia earlier that evening, but savvy to the ways of coup attempts, he never slept in the same place twice. When the first bombs fell, he was already on the move, a specter shifting through his own capital. He vanished into the labyrinth of Panama City. For the next 4 days, the invasion became an occupation, and the primary mission turned into a massive manhunt. American forces, working from flawed intelligence, raided one supposed safe house after another. They found clothes and cash, but no dictator. Noriega was proven to be a master of his own chaotic domain, relying on a dwindling circle of loyalists. He changed vehicles, wore disguises, and likely believed his Santeria protections were still holding. Meanwhile, in a surreal parallel, the political theater played out. On the first day of the invasion, the US had sworn in Guillermo Andara, the bloodied election winner, as the new president of Panama in a makeshift ceremony on a US military base. He took the oath of office with a still swollen face. The image was potent but strange, the birth of a democracy, midwifed by foreign artillery. Noriega's world was shrinking. By December 24, Christmas Eve, he had run out of options. With a $1 million bounty on his head and every roadblock meant, he made a decision that was equal parts desperate and symbolic. He sought asylum at the diplomatic mission of the Holy See. And here, the military invasion morphed into a bizarre psychological siege. US troops surrounded the nunciature, setting up a perimeter of blinding lights and loudspeakers. They knew they couldn't violate the diplomatic sanctity of the Vatican, so they tried to persuade him out. The commander on the ground, a man with a dark sense of humor, ordered psychological operations units to deploy what they called rock and roll therapy. Day and night, a crushing wall of sound was aimed at the building. They played an endless, deafening loop of music chosen, it's said, by the troops themselves. The playlist was a weapon. You Are No Good by Linda Ronstadt, I Thought the Law by The Clash, Nowhere to Run by Martha and the Vandellas, and most famously and relentlessly, Panama by Van Halen. Imagine it, the serene Vatican compound, surrounded by the might of the US military, being assaulted by the screeching guitars of Eddie Van Halen. It was absurd, almost comical, a piece of cultural warfare that felt ripped from a postmodern novel. Priests inside later said the noise was unbearable, driving them to the brink. For Noriega, the man who consulted spirits, this must have been a special kind of hell, a mundane, deafening barrage that no ritual could dispel. It worked. After 10 days in his sonic prison, deprived of his freedom and his dignity, Manuel Noriega surrendered. On January 3, 1990, dressed not in his general's uniform, but in a crisp, light-colored civilian suit, he walked out of the nunciature's front door, a defeated man. He was immediately seized by the US Delta Force operators, put on a waiting helicopter and flown to Howard Air Force Base. There, he was formally arrested, read his Miranda rights, and put on a military transport plane to Florida. He was now prisoner, headed for a cell in the United States. The invasion was over. The strange neighbor had been evicted with extreme prejudice. The cost was high, 23 US military personnel killed, and an estimated 501,000 Panamanian soldiers and civilians dead, with thousands more injured and homeless. Panama City was left scarred, entire blocks of El Cerrillo reduced to smoldering rubble. The price was secured. The canal was safe. The asset was now in a cage. But the story of how this came to be and what it all meant wasn't over. It was just entering its final legal chapter and its long, lingering aftermath in the memory of a nation. The roar of helicopters faded. The last chords of Panama stopped playing, and Manuel Noriega, the once untouchable Codillo, found himself in a place as far from his occult temples and presidential suites as imaginable, a federal courtroom in Miami, Florida. The year was 1991, and the final peculiar act of his story was being written not with decrees of gunfire, but with legal briefs and witness testimonies. His trial was a spectacle of historical irony. The United States, which had for so long used him as an instrument of statecraft, now put that instrument on display to demonstrate its own justice. The charges were entirely about drug trafficking and racketeering. Conspicuously absent were any charges for the acts that had most directly provoked the invasion: the killing of the Marine, the repression, the election fraud. This was a deliberate, calculated framing. It transformed Noriega from a deposed head of state, a political problem, into a common criminal, a narco-terrorist. It was cleaner, simpler for the American public to digest. The evidence presented was damning, much of it from his former cartel associates who had turned state witness. Tapes of phone calls, financial records, and the testimony of pilots and money launderers painted a detailed picture of a man who had monetized his country's sovereignty. Noriega's defense tried a bold strategy. He argued he was a prisoner of war, not a criminal, and that the US courts had no jurisdiction over him. He claimed his actions were known to, and often directed by, the CIA. The judge, William Hoveler, barred most of this national security defense. The messy, symbiotic history of the relationship was declared irrelevant to the specific question of narcotics conspiracy. The trial wasn't about how the monster was created, it was about proving the monster was, in fact, a monster. In April 1992, the verdict came: guilty on 8 counts. The sentence: 40 years in a federal prison. The boy from La Cresta, the CIA's golden asset, the dictator who ruled with fear and witchcraft, was now inmate. He would eventually serve 17 years in the West in a series of prisons before being extradited to France in 2010 on separate money laundering charges, and finally returned to Panama in 2011 to serve a 60-year sentence for murder, the Hugo Spadafora case, among others. He died in a Panamanian hospital in 2017, a sick, old man, his power long since evaporated into myth and legal precedent. But what on Panama itself? The nation woke up on December 21, 1989, to what many called La Liberación and others called La Invasión. The aftermath was a complex, bittersweet reality. The immediate years were a struggle. The US poured in over $1 billion in reconstruction aid, a down payment for the political and physical damage. Guillermo Endara's government, though legitimate, was plagued by a perception of being a US puppet, struggling to assert authority over a shattered country. The Panamanian Defense Forces were disbanded and replaced with a small, civilian-controlled national police. The old corrupt power structure was gone, but the vacuum was filled with uncertainty and new, often chaotic, political forces. Economically, the lifting of sanctions and the restoration of stability brought a slow recovery, but the true psychological and geopolitical closure came exactly as scheduled 10 years later. On December 31, 1999, at noon, under the terms of the Torrijos Carta treaties that Noriega's mentor had signed, the United States formally transferred full control of the Panama Canal and all its adjacent lands to the Republic of Panama. The Canal Zone, that little piece of America, ceased to exist. The Panamanian flag flew alone over the administration building. This moment was, for Panama, the true end of the Noriega chapter and the colonial chapter that preceded it. The country finally owned its greatest treasure. The canal is now managed by the Panama Canal Authority, a point of immense national pride and a massive economic engine. The former military bases have been transformed into bustling ports, business parks, and universities. Panama City's skyline, a forest of glittering towers, is a testament to the post-invasion economic boom, though one that has exacerbated inequality. Yet the scars remain. The fires of El Chorillo are a dark memory. The national psyche is still divided between gratitude for the removal of a tyrant and resentment over the violent sovereign violating method of his removal. The invasion is a reminder that in the game of global powers, small nations can become chessboards, and pawns, no matter how ruthless, are always expendable. So what is the final ledger of this long, strange bedtime story? Noriega, the ultimate realist, died in a prison cell, a fate he likely never saw in his chicken bone readings. The United States achieved its short-term goals. It removed a humiliating liability, secured the canal, and proclaimed a victory for democracy and the war on drugs. And Panama? It gained its sovereignty and its canal, but at the price of a national trauma, a violent baptism into its own independent future. The story ends not with a clear moral, but with a lingering, soft-focused question about power, legacy, and the long, slow work of healing. The canal waters keep flowing, lifting ships from one ocean to another, an internal, silent process. The past is locked away, like a file in a cabinet in Langley, or a memory in the mind of an aging Panamanian who heard the helicopters on a December night. That's all for tonight. Sweet dreams until next time.